Okay, welcome to War, Trauma, and Survival today with the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs. We'll get started very shortly. I'm going to allow one more minute for people to come in. I'm going to get started. People are still coming in. That's okay. Welcome. My name is Lily Egan. I'm the Communications Officer here at the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs at Fordham University. Today, it's my pleasure to introduce this special webinar as part of our A World in Crisis series this semester. Today, we have Senija Mehmedovic. She will be giving a presentation on war, trauma, and survival, a child survivor's journey through genocide, displacement, and gender-based violence. A little bit about the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs before we get started. The Institute was started in 2001, and it's a university-wide center that reports directly to the provost. We do our work by connecting academia and humanitarian efforts worldwide. We are proud to have educated and trained thousands of humanitarian aid workers from nearly every country in the world. Our undergraduate, graduate, and professional training programs equip students with the tools and knowledge to respond thoughtfully and effectively to crises, conflicts, and disasters. These courses are taught by professionals and mix the rigor of academia with the lessons learned from practical experience. We also have several key research areas, a printing press, a gallery on site, and 2 podcasts, which we'll put in the chat towards the end of this presentation. The Institute regularly hosts webinars, lectures, and conferences on humanitarian subjects. The IIHA here at Fordham University is more than a place for future humanitarian aid professionals. It is a hub for anyone passionate about seeking solutions to the world's humanitarian problems. We invite you to explore our website and different opportunities at iihaglobal.org. Now I will introduce Senija Mehmedovic, who will be giving the presentation today. She is a speaker, writer, and survivor of the Srebrenica genocide. Born in Bosnia and Herzegovina, she experienced war and displacement as a young child before immigrating to the United States with her family in 2002. Her work centers on educating audiences about genocide, war trauma, displacement, and human rights through a combination of lived experiences and historical reflection. She earned both her Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and her Master of Science in International Business from DeUval University. Over the years, she has spoken at academic institutions and international forums, including the United Nations Merit University. Senija is also involved with the Bosnian and Herzegovinian Diasporic Conference, a US-based nonprofit organization that brings together scholars, professionals, entrepreneurs, and community leaders from across the Bosnian diaspora. The conference serves as an important platform for dialogue, collaboration, and strengthening connections between Bosnia and Herzegovina. Encouraged by the belief and support of close friends and mentors, Senija is currently completing her first memoir, a project she has been working on for more than 12 years. The memoir reflects memory, survival, and the long-term impact of war through the perspective of a child who lived through it. Through her seminar, War, Trauma, and Survival, A Child Survivor's Journey Through Genocide, Displacement, and Gender-Based Violence, she invites audiences to reflect on history, human resilience, and the responsibility we share in remembering and preventing atrocities. At the end, please join us for a Q&A. You'll use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'm so pleased to introduce Senija. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Egan, on that wonderful introduction. And let's begin. So, thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. From my understanding, you couldn't see my presentation, and I do apologize for that. I'm a child survivor of Srebrenica genocide. What I share with you today is not something I study from a distance. It is something I lived through as a child. This presentation is called War, Trauma, and Survival because these three words are not separated. They're connected. One leads into the next. To understand survival, you first have to understand what was lost. To begin this journey the right way, I want to start with the most important foundation, a disclaimer and opening remarks that set the emotional and ethical tone of everything that follows. Before I begin, this presentation brings together personal memory, historical documentation, and the voices of survivors whose stories are often left out. Some of what I say may feel heavy, and in reality, discomfort is part of reality because genocide is not just an event. It is an experience that continues long after the violence ends. And that is exactly what I want to guide you through today. Not just what happened, but what it means to live after it. As you listen, I want you to engage not only intellectually, but emotionally, because the story of Bosnia is not just documented in archives. It is carried in the hearts of its survivors. Life before war. To understand how everything collapsed, we have to begin with what existed before. Bosnia was a multi-ethnic society. People lived together across religious and cultural lines. Neighborhoods were shared, schools were shared, lives were shared. For many families, including mine, identity was not something that separated us in everyday life. And that is what makes what comes next so important. Because genocide does not begin with violence. It begins with slow unraveling of trust between people who once lived side by side. To understand how our world collapsed, we must begin with the political unraveling that started decades earlier. After the death of Josip Broz Tito in 1980, the balance that held Yugoslavia together began to weaken. By the late 1980s, nationalist ideology started gaining power, political language shifted, fear was introduced into everyday conversation. By 1991 and 1992, countries began declaring independence. And when Bosnia declared independence, it did not just become a new state, it became a battleground. This shift from political change to violent conflict did not happen overnight. It was built through something much more subtle, which led directly into the next phase. One of the forces was the rise of Slobodan Milosevic and the nationalist project that fueled genocide. Milosevic didn't simply rise to power. He built a mechanism capable of industrial scale brutality. Under his leadership, neighbors who once shared coffee became informants. Towns were emptied house by house. Women were used into weapons of war. Mass graves were dug, emptied, moved, and covered in secrecy. Families carried only photographs because everything else, homes, documents, memories, was burned in erased evidence they ever existed. But Bosnia was not only vulnerable because of external forces, it was also uniquely trapped by geography. To understand why Bosnia suffered so brutally, we must look at its impossible position when independence arrived. Early warning signs. Before mass violence began, there was always warning signs. In Bosnia, these signs were visible. Propaganda began targeting specific groups. People were identified, labeled, and separated. Armed groups began forming. Checkpoints appeared where there had never been barriers before. Religious and cultural symbols were deliberately destroyed. These actions may seem small in isolation, but together they create a symbol of division. And once people are divided, violence becomes easier to justify. That is how society transitioned from coexistence to conflict. One of the early signs was today, in today's society, we mark May 31st as White Armband Day. On May 31st, 1992, in Prijedor, Bosniaks and Croats were ordered to wear white armband and mark their homes with white sheets. This was not symbolic. It was identification, humiliation, and segregation. The deliberate first step towards extermination. Within weeks, over 3,000 were killed, tens of thousands expelled. Men were taken into concentration camps like Omarska and Ternopolje. The world had already promised once again. Yet, never again. Yet, here was never again happening again in broad daylight. And with Prijedor marking the beginning, Sarajevo would later become the most haunting symbol of suffering. One question on everyone's minds when learning about war in Bosnia and from what happened is why Bosnia could not defend itself. Bosnia did not fail to defend itself. Bosnia was prevented from defending itself. The Yugoslav army, now controlled by Belgrade, removed nearly every weapon from Bosnian territory. The UN imposed an arms embargo, treating the aggressor and the victim as equal. Serb forces inherited tanks, artillery, and ammunition. Bosnia inherited empty hands. Our soldiers fought with hunting rifles, melted metals, and sheer courage. They created uniforms out of donated clothing. They faced the second largest military stockpile in Europe with almost nothing. The imbalance didn't create peace. It created a condition for genocide. And within the environment, some of the darkest moments began to unfold. The Siege of Sarajevo. Sarajevo became a symbol of their vulnerability. For 1,425 days, the city was under constant siege. Civilians were targeted daily through sniper fire and shellings. 11,541 people were killed. 1,601 were children. 50,000 were wounded. 13,000 sniper and artillery positions. 329 shells per day were fired. The max shells fired in one day was 3,777 shells. Imagine growing up where stepping outside was a life-threatening decision. This was not a distant war zone. It was daily life for thousands of families. And while Sarajevo represented urban suffering, there was another reality unfolding in rural areas of Srebrenica. Life in Srebrenica. Srebrenica was the surrounding villages were geographically isolated. My village of Suceska. We were not that far off a border from Serbia. These were small mountain communities with limited infrastructure and resources. There was no asphalt road in where I grew up. It was gravel road or barely any road. You want to get somewhere, you create your own path. Family relied on farming, on each other, and tight-knit support system. I grew up, I'm a country girl through and through. And the way we survived was we had a lot of agriculture fields where we would plant corn and any other vegetables from it. One thing that we planted was tobacco, which was we used to trade. But as war intensified, that isolation became a danger. Supplies routes were cut off, protection was non existent, communities became trapped, and for families like mine, survival became a daily calculation. In 1993, April, the reality became personal for me. A grenade exploded near my family. Actually, it was thrown in my cousin's front yard. And when my parents were in a field taking care of crops, my uncle came and got me and took me to the nearest village doctor. He patched me up from it. He said there shouldn't be no lasting impact of the injury. If only that was true. The moment didn't just injure me physically, it changed how I experienced the world. I lived with permanent damage to my eyesight and later on oral health. But today, it marked the moment where childhood ended. But beyond that, it marked the moment where childhood ended. What does not ask how old you are. It does not wait for you to understand it. It simply arrives and divides your life into before and after. And for many families in Srebrenica, that after became even more devastating in 1995. In July 11th, 1995, it was any normal day for my family and me. In the morning, my aunt and I, we went to take care of our livestock. Around 10-ish o'clock, she yelled at me, Senija, stop daydreaming, pay attention to the livestock. And I responded with, oh, they're by the river. They're getting water to drink. Next thing I knew, my body was slammed against a stone, and there was a man hovering over me. That same exact spot I was sitting at, a grenade was thrown. And he took me and carried me all the way to home. And he told my father that him and his family will be leaving. And there was nothing. There's no longer nothing waiting or be able to stay for. Srebrenica, it has been declared a UN safe area on April 16, 1993. A place where civilians were supposed to feel protected. But when Bosnian Serbs forces entered, that protection did not hold. 8,372 men and boys were killed. Families were separated in a matter of hours. Women and children were forced into buses. Men were taken away by force. For many, that was the last time they saw their fathers, brothers, or sons. And for those who tried to escape, survival took on a completely different form. And the place where we saw safety became a nightmare. Potocari was meant to be a refuge. Instead, it became a graveyard of hope. Over 25,000 civilians were trapped in unbearable heat. Babies cried from hunger, mothers fainted, UN peacekeepers stood powerless. Soldiers ripped men and boys from their families. Some parents tried holding sons under blankets or dressing them as girls, desperate to keep them alive. Potachari was not protection, it was a waiting room for genocide. Mass graves. What happened in Srebrenica continued in a way it was hidden. Bodies were buried in mass graves. More than 90 mass graves have been linked to Srebrenica alone. Later, those graves were disturbed and moved to secondary locations to conceal evidence. This was not just killing, it was an attempt to erase. But the truth did not stay buried. Mass graves were uncovered across Bosnia. Forensic team began identifying victims using DNA. 22,000 DNA matches have been made. Families received answers years later, sometimes in fragments, because many victims were found in multiple graves. So when we talk about justice, we are also talking about identification, about dignity, and restoring names. How mass graves were uncovered? One was satellite imagery showing disturbed earth, witness testimonies from survivors and perpetrators. Forensic investigations led by international courts. Srebrenica and Bosnia were key facts. At this point, I want to pause the ground with these numbers. In Srebrenica, over 8,000 men and boys were killed, 8,372. Across the war in Bosnia, around 100,000 people lost their lives. These numbers are overwhelming. They're not just statistics. Each number represents a person, a family, a life interrupted. And many of these stories are still being uncovered. 83% were civilians that were killed. Around, as I mentioned earlier, around 25,000 women, children, and elderly were forcibly expelled. Over 7,000 victims were identified through DNA analysis. Around 1,000 victims remain missing today. Thousands were killed in warehouses, schools, fields, and forest clearings. 16 individuals have been convicted so far. This one, next slide, is a bit personal. After seeing numbers like these, it's easy to feel distant. But for me, this is personal. 4 of my uncles were killed in Srebrenica. My mom lost 2 of her brothers, and her sisters lost their husbands. They were not statistics. They have names, they had lives, they had future that were taken. And like many families, we did not receive answers right away. My mother received a notice of her brother's remains being found in May of 2008. And they were killed in 1995. So let that sink in. Some remains were found years later. Some were still incomplete. This meaning only 30% of the remains were recovered. One of her brothers his remains were found in a secondary grave, which was where the body was moved to from primary grave. This is what genocide looks like inside one family. My father was one of the men who fled into forest. The day that we left Srebrenica on July 11th, around noon, as we entered Ljaskovic, my father decided to separate from us. The stories of men and women being separate started circling around as we were leaving. His last words to my mother were, "Take care of my children." What followed was a 37-day journey through extreme danger. There were ambushes, landmines, starvation, exhaustion. My father's drive to survive was us children, especially my brother that was 11 months old. Many who started that journey did not survive. When my father reached safely, he survived physically. But survival is not the same as being whole. The psychological impact of what experience stayed with him and shaped our family long after the war ended. When he returned to us, a following week later, he had to report to a local military base. Gender-based violence. At the same time, another form of violence was being used systematically. In Žepa, for instance, and Visegrad, women and girls were targeted through sexual violence. It was not random, it was deliberate. There were actual rape camps organized. It was used to terrorize communities, to break families, and to leave lasting psychological and social damage. These experiences are often underrepresented in discussion about war, but they are central to understanding the full scope of what happened. And now we get to trauma. What happens after survival? This is where trauma begins to take shape. Survivors often live with PTSD, anxiety, depression, and survival guilt. And in the aftermath of war, support systems were extremely limited. Trauma does not end when violence ends. It carries into adulthood, into families, into future generations, which brings us to the most important question: what do we do with this knowledge? And I will probably repeat what I just said in more details as I continue. Now we enter part of the story that doesn't end with the war. Trauma is not something that stops when guns fall silent. It passes into homes, into marriages, into children's hearts, and into generations. And the first place it shows was in a man. For Bosniak men, survival was not only the beginning of the struggle. Trauma followed them into peacetime, but mental illness was seen as weakness. Speaking about pain was shameful. Getting help was unthinkable. My father lived with schizophrenia. As children, we took turns staying awake at night to keep him and ourselves safe. For many men, the silence became deadlier than war itself. To understand why, we must look at expectations placed on them. Bosnian men and every other man were raised to be protectors, strong, resilient, unbreakable. They were taught, don't cry, don't show fear, don't ask for help. After war, these expectations became lethal. Men who survived torture, execution, and the forest were told, return to normal. But how do you return to normal after seeing what they saw? Their silence spilled into lives of their wives and families. The men who came home were alive but deeply wounded. They lived with nightmares, hypervigilance, guilt, fear, and no access to mental health support. And their silence forced women to carry on the emotional fallout. Bosnian women rebuilt home while holding families together. Women rebuilt what war tried to destroy. Their own pain was often overlooked. Yet trauma did not stop with the adults. Children absorbed it too. My siblings and I grew up with instability, fear, and resilience. We took turns staying awake at night. We learned not to ask too many questions. We grew up too fast. But we also developed strength, determination, and deep bond with one another. Trauma shaped us, but it did not define our future. Despite everything, war, displacement, poverty, stigma, my siblings and I built lives that honor our parents' sacrifice. Two became nurses, one became an entrepreneur, one became an executive, and one became a full-time mother, which in itself is a full-time job. And I became the first to finish high school and college. A teacher that told me that I would be in special ed school was wrong. Still, trauma continue to show up in our daily lives. Survivor Survival is not the ending of suffering. It is the beginning of responsibility. And for many Bosnian families, including mine, survival came with guilt. My cousins grew up without fathers. I grew up with mine. The difference created guilt. I didn't know how to call it as a child. Aid was often denied to us because my father survived. Some aid boxes arrived empty, taken by those who wanted more, even when they already had more. Survival became a burden, not a blessing. And guilt eventually became identity, especially for children. If you took a look at this progression, there is a pattern. Genocide begins with division, with language, and separates people with narrative that humanizes. By the time violence begins, the groundwork had already been laid. That is why recognizing early signs is critical. And that is why memory matters, not just as a remembrance, but as a prevention. This work does not end with one presentation. It continues through conversation, education, and collaboration. If you would like to continue this dialogue or learn more about my work, you can reach me at my email. You can also connect with me on LinkedIn, where I share my work. I'm also proud affiliate of Big Diaspora Conference, which Dr. Egan mentioned earlier. If you're interested in learning more or getting involved, you can visit the conference page as well. And I stand as I stand here today as someone who survived, but also someone who carried responsibility to speak, responsibility to remember, responsibility to make sure these stories are not reduced to statistics. Because once something becomes just a number, it becomes easier to ignore. Memory without action is storytelling. Action turns remembrance into protection. Listen to survivors. Challenge hate. Advocate for refugees. Support justice. Educate the next generation. Reject neutrality in the face of injustice. Every person in this room has influence. Use it. Bosnia truth is carried in its families, in graves, in memories, in the bones of our history. My hope is that today did not just inform you, it moved you. That you will carry these memories with reverence and courage. That you will choose humanity in moments where silence is easy. Thank you for listening. Thank you for remembering. Thank you for choosing humanity. And now I welcome your questions.
Senija, first I want to thank you for sharing this very detailed presentation on the Srebrenica genocide and your personal story. My heart breaks for everything you and your family have gone through. We received some questions in advance of this webinar, so I'll be asking you those first, and then we'll move on to the Q&A for questions that live participants have submitted. The first question is, how can we raise awareness about the Kosovo genocide? Many people still don't know much about. Both are recent and overlooked.
That's actually simple. I know it's a heavy topic to be discussed. Simply by partnering with schools and universities to include their curriculum, writing to your representatives, both state and federal level, using social media intentionally, short videos, survival clips, and key facts, organizing annual panels or webinars with survivors and scholars, and challenge denial publicly when you see it, being silenced. It's not an easy task, and it's not something that's easily spoken about, but we have a responsibility, and that responsibility is to prevent future atrocities. Unfortunately, we have failed for so many, whether that be Ukraine, Gaza, Myanmar, Sudan. So simply just creating an event.
Thank you. The next question is, how does prolonged exposure to war-related trauma shape a child survivor's psychological development, coping mechanisms, and capacity for resilience?
Recognizing pattern, then respond. Children may show anxiety, withdrawal, or overachievement. For me, I was a very active kid. At the same time, I was socially withdrawn. Provide access to mental health support early. If you notice a change in a child, act on it. Create environments that are predictable and safe. It could simply be having a set of books or a puzzle or a game on hand, to make sure that this individual feels safe, especially if they're a child, and build resilience through mentorship, education, and giving them a sense of purpose. That would be my answer.
Thank you. And I'll move through the next few quickly, just so we can leave time for our live participants. Senija, what made you want to share your story?
My father passed away in September of 2020, and I felt as that it was my responsibility. I was grown up enough to understand what happened in Srebrenica, and that his story needed to be told and shared, and maybe it could benefit somebody. It could get somebody to ask for help, or Just simply knowing that, in especially men and boys that have survived a genocide, whether in Kosovo, Albania, Croatia, Bosnia, that it's okay to ask for help. I know for my father it was difficult, and the treatment that he endured was scary. He was in a psychiatric hospital for 2 months. He endured electroshock therapy, and the man that went into that hospital came out as a child. He was skinny, skin and bone. So, but he was, but he came normal. I had my father back. So,
As an educator, I would be happy to have tips and insights for dealing with young learner victims of trauma, part of my language classroom.
uh, I like that question a lot. I apply trauma informed teaching. And I know when I say I apply trauma informed teaching, uh, teach your students that it's okay to ask for help. It's okay to say that you feel overwhelmed. Um, there are adults in classroom that they can talk to. Start with the routine and structure. Do not force participation. Offer options like writing, art, or small group works. For me, growing up, writing was my way out. I wrote every chance I get. I have a stack of journals that I still keep that I write my thoughts every single day on. Avoid triggering content without preparations. And that being said, is why I have the disclaimer at the beginning of my presentation, giving heads up of what to follow. So I hope that answered the question.
Thank you, Senija. What approaches, in your view, are more suited to populations affected by mass traumatic events?
Simply by investing creating investment in schools and healthcare as well as social services pertaining to trauma informed care. It could simply be, I don't know, what to look for in a person, or what are the symptoms, or that having a hotline for people to call, and just having a sense of belonging and purpose. I know, for me, if it wasn't for my mother and encouraged me to seek counseling, I probably wouldn't have done it. And talking to somebody has definitely been very impactful in my life.
Now we'll move on to the live questions. We have two.
Okay.
Okay. The first one is, well, first, thank you so much for sharing your story. I'm curious as to your thoughts regarding the warning signs and what is happening today with ICE and the migrant community.
Oh, that's heavy one. It cannot be easy. I know. There were individuals. A friend of mine, she lives in Minneapolis, and there were ICE agents in the community where her parents lived, and that sort of put a. I'm not sure what the legal status of her parents or family is, but it definitely caused them to be on high alert, and that alone, simply, I know some of them have started therapy, just finding somebody to talk to, uh, creating a social media group anonymously to just express. And I know with limited resources, especially for non-for-profits, funding has been cut. So it's just something that needs to be more researched, and for individuals to have resources where to turn for help. Like, whether that be a volunteer lawyers project, or um, simply asking a friend for help.
Thank you, Senija. The next and final question is first, thank you so much for sharing your story and bearing witness. When was the moment that you first realized and internalized your responsibility to bear witness?
I was a sophomore in college, and we were discussing about a Bosnian war and a professor made a remark about how Bosnia has become a country without a law. Um, I felt like saying there were a lot of just people, ignored it, and at that moment, it led me into this rabbit hole of doing the research, and not only because I was a child when war happened, and my certain things that I remember were a lot different from things that my mom remembers. For me, I didn't want to leave when we left July 11. She actually had to lie to me, tell me that we were going to visit my aunt, um, who lost her husband, and her son became one of the witnesses for Ratko Mladic, that we were going to visit her house because I there were a pair of purple sandals that I was going to wear to the year I was supposed to start school, and my dad had bought me these pair of purple sandals that I was gonna wear, and I didn't want to leave them behind. But my mom knew we couldn't carry them, so she lied to me and told me that we're gonna be visiting my aunt, and that's a story that stuck in my head, and just it's just me speaking is a way of honoring my father, and hopefully I can make a difference in someone else's life.
Thank you for answering the questions, Senija. I'll give one more minute in case attendees want to submit any more questions via the Q&A at the bottom of your screen. And as I announced at the beginning of the webinar, we've included more information about the Institute of International Humanitarian Affairs, where I work. And that's all in the chat. We have a series of webinars coming up next month on the future of humanitarian aid. And based on one of the questions, I'm going to actually include one more page on our website. We have a mental health and complex emergencies course. And I know childhood psychological effects from trauma. So you may be interested in checking that course out, which is open to everyone. Senija, I want to thank you again so much for joining the Institute and hosting a webinar. You and I have been planning this for well over a month now, and I really appreciate you giving the presentation on such a difficult topic. And one question actually just popped up. So this will make our last question before we close out this webinar. Intergenerational transmission of trauma. How do you think trauma impacts across generations in history, genocide to wars? Thanks.
For me personally, is that I, from growing up with schizophrenic father, we learn not to ask questions. We learned we grew up too fast. We were children, but at the same time became adults. One of the largest thing for me was the survival guilt, as I mentioned earlier, and that carries into every single day. I hope that answers the questions. If not, I am more than welcome to take this conversation offline. So my contact information are provided in the PowerPoint.
I will include your email now in the chat. Okay, so for all of you who are still on, you're more than welcome to direct questions to wartraumasurvival@gmail.com. That is Senia's direct email address. You can also email IIHA outreach at fordham.edu with questions, or if you're interested in hosting a webinar with us, please reach out. And if you reach out about questions on today's webinar, we're happy to direct you to Senia's Gmail. So with that, I'm going to close out this webinar. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you again, Senija, for presenting.
Thank you for inviting me and have a great day.
Have a great day. Bye-bye.